Well, thank you very much to Martin for this fantastic invitation tonight. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Emily Mayhew is author of Wounded, From Battlefield to Blighty, 1914 to 1918, and this was shortlisted for the Wellcome Prize last year. She's a research associate at Imperial College and consultant and lecturer to various museums, including the Wellcome Collection, the Imperial War Museum, and the Royal College of Surgeons. Her first book, The Reconstruction of Warriors, was published in 2004. Emily's primary research interest is the history of the medical treatment of severe casualty in 20th and 21st century warfare. She's determined to ensure that, in particular, the work and the courage of the stretcher bearers of the Great War is properly represented during the centenary commemorations. Thanks very much, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Carla. This is, we're going to really be talking about the beginning and the ending of the war, because I'm going to talk about some of the very first people that casualties encounter in the First World War, the most important people. And Mark and Louis are going to talk about some of the very endings of casualty. And so I hope that our two presentations make a kind of sense for you at the end. I'm going to give you some pretty basic facts about stretcher bearers in Britain, and this is very different to stretcher bearers at the rest of the war. So what I'm saying is really only relevant for British stretcher bearers and British casualties. So that's an important point I want to make. By the end of 1914, the military medical authorities, and indeed the military authorities in Britain, knew that the system that they had for treating and evacuating the wounded was a catastrophe. It had worked in Britain's wars of the 19th century, but it had failed abysmally in France, where the volume of casualties and the severity of their wounds demanded a complete reorganization from the very ground up of all treatment of casualties. They had an efficient system, the system that had worked up until 1900. Some of the best surgeons in the country waited in newly refurbished hospitals at the coast, while men fell 60 or 150 miles away and simply died in ambulances on the way to those shiny new hospitals, or they got to surgeons who knew that there would be nothing that they could do for them. The entire system couldn't stay where it was, and it had to move forward. The field hospital, as we now have it today, was born at that point in January 1915, when the hospitals, the base hospitals on the coast of France, moved forward as far as they could get towards the sound of battle. They knew that that wasn't going to be enough, that the people who suffered these extraordinarily drastic and severe casualties from new industrially produced weapons needed expert treatment where they fell, as soon as someone could get to them. It was not enough that they were put onto a stretcher or carried out, and then treatment begins from a doctor 10, 15, 20 minutes or an hour after evacuation. The first person who encountered them had to know what they were doing. Previously, stretcher bearers were musicians, or, as the Royal Army Medical Corps put it, people too big or too stupid to do proper soldiering. This really wasn't good enough, and in January 1915, they began to recruit specifically to provide an expert stretcher bearer corps. There was a 10-week course at the confusingly named Cambridge Hospital in Aldershot. I begged the Ministry of Defence to do something about that, but they won't. Where they learned to be the very first responders, the first what we would now call combat medical technicians. And they learnt 3 crucial skills that had never been seen before used by medical auxiliaries in war. They learnt to stop bleeding, to prevent hemorrhage. They learned to splint fractures. A fracture, particularly a femoral fracture to the thigh, could prove fatal, and preventing that happening, enabling a casualty to survive a femoral fracture was absolutely crucial. And they learned to control primary shock. So the shock a casualty felt on first receiving their wound. They learned those three things. They learned much else besides, but if you couldn't stop a man bleeding on the Western Front, you might as well not be there. They arrived out in the front, the new teams of stretcher bearers, and were assigned to a medical officer. And he had been instructed in this reorganisation, and one of the things that was insisted upon was that a weekly lecture be given to the stretcher bearers, and that it should not be skipped or rushed, and that together both stretcher bearers and medical officer would learn about casualty at the war. And so what you have halfway through 1915 is the world's first specialist stretcher bearer corps. It's a remarkable achievement. And when I'm asked the question that I'm almost always asked, which is, what is the greatest medical achievement of the First World War? That's what it is, the creation of a specialist stretcher bearer corps. And I shall go on saying that until you dream about it tonight. I could tell you a lot of detail about the medical achievements that they make, what is expected of them, but I want to talk about another space that they occupy, a space that is closer to Louis and Marc's work. And that is the space where they are dealing with the impacts of pain, of shock, and of death. At the heart of it, the thing that stretcher bearers took responsibility for was the moment that a soldier ceases to become a soldier and becomes a casualty. The moment that someone who has a gun, who is independent, who is about to undertake fighting, ceases to be someone who can take responsibility for his own life, who is dependent on other people to bring him to safety, to get him out and to keep him alive. And that is a moment then, as it is today, of profound stress for that young soldier. It is a moment of great fear. It is a moment where time itself is turned upside down. And that is in addition to the pain that they are actually suffering from their wound. They cry out, they become noisy, they lose a sense of the rest of the world around them. They become lost in their own pain and in their own crisis. And it is a stretcher bearer, a medical auxiliary, who will manage on the Great War, who will manage, and a combat medical technician today, who will manage that process for them. And that is something that they have to learn on their own. There's no course and no lecture from their medical officer that can help them with that. Stretcher bearers talk about their lives being about being at the heart of pain. And I think this is a very important place to remember that they are. In fact, if you think about all the places on the Western Front that you know, the images that you know, the trenches, no man's land, the battlefield, all the famous visual references that we have for the Great War, there's one thing that's wrong in almost every representation, and that is that there's no stretcher bearers there. There were always stretcher bearers. In the frontline trenches, as men readied themselves to go over the top, as they listened for the whistles of the officers that would send them, have them push up their ladders and would send them over the top, stretcher bearers are at the back, holding their stretchers, trying to make themselves look as small as possible, because they're being jostled by the soldiers who consider them to be very bad luck. They tell them, get a gun, do some real fighting, get out of the way, and they try not to touch them because they think it's a bad luck charm rather than a good luck charm. The soldiers go out, fired up in the heat of battle. Bearers go out in absolute coolness because it is their job to push themselves out over the top with their stretcher, and immediately don't listen for the guns, but listen for the screams of those men who have fallen first. I talk about them being in a place of pain. Many of them reach the casualties, and the first thing the casualty does is experience immense guilt that they are one of the people who jostled the stretcher bearer and told him to get a gun. And they cry louder and more pitifully, and the stretcher bearers all learn a lesson to say, it doesn't matter. We're used to it. It really doesn't matter. Let's get you on the stretcher and let's get you sorted. And when they've calmed the patient, when the patient is lying quietly, they try to negotiate with him about not giving him painkillers. This is another important skill that develops on the Western Front. They don't want to give too much morphine. Getting a man who's doped up to the eyeballs on morphine is going to be difficult for the surgeon who may need to amputate a limb. They learn to negotiate with drugs. They learn to control pain with their expertise, with their calmness, with their voices, We'll be home, we'll be there soon, just another 10 minutes. And then they have to make more difficult decisions. And many of the resources that I read about stretcher bearers, they talk about the making up your mind time. When you have arrived in a shell hole and there are 8 or 9 casualties, it's going to be difficult for you to get them all out. You must go round and look at them, triage them silently to yourself, and decide which one you think has the best chance, who you are going to bring out, who of the 4 out of the 8 or the 2 out of the 8 you think will survive. And then you go and look at the others, give them some morphine, maybe give them enough morphine to put them unconscious completely, from which point they will die. Give them a cigarette. To sit back on your heels and light a cigarette. Stretcher bearers always carry cigarettes, and they always carry dry matches. And light a cigarette, because a dying man has made up your mind for you, has said, don't leave me, I'm not going to survive. Take my comrades, but at least give me a cigarette. That is where the stretcher bearer is in that shell hole, for hours at a time, negotiating with those people, making his mind up himself, and finally loading up people that they think they can save. The carry was the stretcher bearer's life. It was getting a casualty onto a stretcher, and it was where their strength and resolution came into play. They had already made them strong enough, prevented their bleeding, given them the morphine, given them water, whatever was immediately medically necessary. And now they had to carry a heavy man over the top, down into a trench that may have collapsed, and keep him calm during that entire process. This was a remarkable set of skills that was required from them. You could drop down into a trench and discover that it had been wrecked by a shell, so you needed to get back up on top and look across and find where you were going to go to. One stretcher bearer recalled going down into a trench that was full of soldiers, and he called out gangway stretchers, the standard term, and nobody moved. And he tried again, and nobody moved. And he went up and touched the shoulder of the soldier, and the soldier fell over dead. A shell had exploded in the trench and killed everybody. And it was so compact that everyone had died where they stood. And so they went back to their patient, and they said, close your eyes and close them tightly. And whatever happens, don't open them. Managing the patient's pain on the stretcher as they went, and then they pushed the corpses over and made a pathway. I read about a similar story in the American Civil War, actually, in the Battle of the Wilderness, where a battlefield had turned entirely to corpses. There were so many dead and so many compacted. This is something that they could never possibly have been prepared for. If the journey takes a long time, and it could take a very long time, if you had picked up a casualty on the battlefield and the battle was still raging, the aid post might have been destroyed or moved. The journey could take 2, 3, 4 hours. They would have to stop, give more medical treatment, give more water, whatever was necessary to keep the casualty alive. If there was a gas attack, they would have to get a gas mask on a struggling casualty. They would have to decide which one of them might forfeit a gas mask and try to cope just with his greatcoat collar around his mouth and get back somehow in the gas, with the gas around them. Stretcher bearers often had a problem that they were panting from the effort, and you read of very many stretcher bearers who suffer from the effects of gas, either respiratory problems or temporary blindness. These are all the complications that they have. And then there are the other extraordinary places that we find stretcher bearers, and that I'm very much hoping that by the end of this commemoration, they start to become visible again. Stretcher bearers deal with shell shock. They start to learn that those are soldiers that they will encounter. In a diary entry by a stretcher bearer that's kept at the Imperial War Museum, he tells of a morning when he was returning to the aid post, and it was misty and very cold. And he noticed on his way that there was a boulder in his path that he hadn't noticed before. And stretcher bearers paid attention to their pathways changing. They needed to know if they could bring a stretcher there. They needed to adjust their map. And this, by the way, is a stretcher bearer map. You have to be very good at drawing maps. And you'll also notice it's pencil and it's not ink. Ink's useless on the Western Front. Your pens break and leak. Everybody has a little tiny box of crayons, the sort of thing we'd get in a cracker these days, because all you need to do with your crayon is sharpen it. So you can see this is where they've used the crayon. So James Brady was the stretcher bearer's name. He started to think about making a note of this new boulder that had appeared, that had perhaps been blasted there by a shell. But as he drew closer, he realized it was not a boulder, that it was in fact a man, hunched over and covered in mud. And it was a soldier, quite literally frozen to the spot. He was alive, and he was, as far as the stretcher bearer could see, quite unwounded. But he was frozen, not just from the cold, but also from fear. He referred to him as being petrified. And I think he meant both petrified in terms of fear, but also petrified as in a petrified forest. And try as he might, he could not unroll him from this position. He could not move him. And so he went and he got his medical officer. And together, they pushed the soldier along the road as if he was a boulder. In fact, he talks about him as if he was a garden statue. And as they pushed him, he moved and left tracks in the dirt. And eventually, they got him back to the aid post, and an ambulance came and took him away. But again, a stretcher bearer is there. At the first point, a terrified soldier, a shocked soldier, encounters the medical staff. It is a stretcher bearer that they see first. The final place that stretcher bearers can be seen, and again, this is completely invisible in the history at the moment, is the execution of deserters. The execution of deserters required the presence not only of the officers of the court-martial and of the firing squad, but a medical officer who would perform an autopsy and a stretcher bearer team who will bear the body away. It was the worst job. It was the job they didn't want of all jobs, and very few of them write about it. But one of them did, and he talked about how 4 of his men were summoned to the execution of a very young soldier for cowardice and for desertion, and how one of the bearers was very young. He was a 17-year-old who shouldn't have been there, but he lied about his age to the recruiter. And when they arrived with the firing squad and the post to which the soldier would be tied to, he tried to run away. And the officer commanding the firing squad turned him round and held him and said, "If you do not watch this with your eyes open, you will suffer a very severe punishment." And the young man, and indeed the stretcher bearer team, watched as the soldier was executed. The young man collapsed. One of the bearers fainted, and he was physically sick. But they did, as they always were forced to do, go up. It was bearers who went up to the post after the coup de grace had been administered, who untied the body, who loaded it onto their stretcher, and who took it away to the medical officer for the autopsy to be performed. Stretcher bearers are everywhere. They are at the heart of the war's pain. And so what I've hoped to do tonight is to alert you to that. Look for them whenever you see a story of the war, a representation of the war. Challenge someone who doesn't include them properly in the history of the war, because they are there and they are crucially important. And so thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell you about their work.
Well, thank you very much, Emily, for that insight into a very little-known aspect of the Great War. We will have some time for some questions after both speakers. So for the moment, I'll just go ahead and introduce our second speaker. Louis Crocq is a retired French army psychiatrist and clinical psychologist who specialises in war neurosis. He's also an Associate Emeritus Professor at Paris Descartes University, and he'll be presenting with his son, Marc-Antoine, who is also a psychiatrist. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you, Claire, also for making it possible. I'll give the presentation from my father. The main topic of this presentation will be psychiatric casualties in World War I and the evolution of diagnoses. The diagnoses that were used at the time are not the diagnoses that we use today. Today we say PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a diagnosis that was created in 1980 by the Americans after the Vietnam War. So PTSD refers to the consequences of extreme fear, of extreme stressors on those stressors create anxiety symptoms. The term was coined in 1980, but the reality existed much before that, since the antiquity, and we describe how those concepts developed during World War I. So that's how it started. It started as a short war, and people expected to be home by Christmas. This picture was taken at Paris, Gare de l'Est. Gare de l'Est is important in this context. It's where most trains would depart to go to the front. So it's Gare de l'Est has the same role in history as the Gare of Byelorussia in Moscow. It's the railway station where all trains would depart. And if you go to the Gare de l'Est today, there's still a huge fresco on the wall that depicts a train leaving with the soldiers saying their farewells to their relative. And also, that's how it started in a military that was quite unprepared. So those were the uniforms at the start of the war, with the red trousers that transformed the soldiers into living targets. I took this picture. It's from the 124th Infantry Regiment. I chose this picture because it's the regiment where my grandfather, or Louis' father, was drafted, and I am here today because my grandfather survived, and he survived because he made two decisions, one involuntary, one voluntary. The first fact is that he was too short. So they didn't, at the start of the war, they did not want him immediately, but he still came back and volunteered. So that made it impossible for him to reach the front 3 or 4 months later, where the first battle with a heavy rate of casualties were over. So that's one reason why he survived, because he was drafted a few months later. The second reason was he survived is that he was a primary school teacher. So he was supposed to be brainy as a teacher, and they suggested that he should do an officer training. And he refused to do that. And it was a good decision because at the start of the war, as Emily said, there was the whistle. You had to climb out of the trench, charge, and the officers would go first and would be mowed down first by all the incoming fire. So he preferred to stay an anonymous soldier, and that's why he survived. And an anecdote he told us, at the start of the war, they had those red trousers, those red pants, and they were given the big pants that factory workers would use. They were given a huge blue pants to put over the red trousers to cover them, to make them less conspicuous. So that's the start of the war, and a fact that's not well known. The highest rate of casualty was in the first weeks or months. So it's the so-called battle at the borders. The French military moved to meet the German military in Belgium, and as the graph below shows, the highest rate of casualty by far was in the first 2 months of the war. And later on, you had big battles like Verdun or the Somme that had a huge total of casualties, but not at the same intense rate. So that's the traumas that were encountered, and the trauma was a direct exposure, an immediate exposure to death. Death by, there were artillery preparations, and you had a direct first-hand contact with the death, your death or the death of your colleague. And because of that, the first clinical pictures that was described by the French doctors was called battle hypnosis. People who survived those bombing, artillery preparations, came back in a trance with like amnesiacs, not forgetting their name, forgetting their regiment, having no recollection of the circumstances, and it would be called hypnosis, battle hypnosis, and it would take a few days, hours or days or weeks to subside, and for those people to come back to reality, to be no longer in a state of depersonalization or derealization. And what was a very frequent symptom at the start of the war were soldiers that shaked and without control, could not control themselves, and they were called trembleurs or war shakers. And also other symptoms like disorders of gait, people having could not walk normally. What is interesting is that both those shakings and gait disorders did not correspond to normal neurological symptoms. And so there was so that created the first diagnostic discussion. Is that neurology? Are those loss of function neurological disorders? Is it plain malingering, just people shocking or trying to consciously imitate an illness, or was it something in between, which at that time was called hysteria? The difference between hysteria and malingering is that in malingering you produce an illness. You know it's not real, and you do it consciously. In hysteria, you produce symptoms that are not based on a physiological, on an anatomical lesion. You produce symptoms, but you do it unconsciously. And so that was the discussion at the time. Were those symptoms neurological injury based on a lesion? Was it hysteria, unconscious producing of symptoms? Hysteria was also called pithiotism at the time. Pithiotism is a Greek word which means suggestion, persuasion, which meant that you could, the idea was that you could cure those soldiers by persuading them, by persuasion, or malingering. And one of the, so that was the first diagnostic term that was used, hysteria. And one way to cure that was electrotherapy, or Faradic treatment, that at times went to extreme, especially in this. So this shows a doctor whose name is Clovis Vincent. He was at Tours, and difficult cases were sent to him. Here, the doctor follows the patient with electrodes. And the idea was that with applying enough electricity, enough electrodes, you would torpedo the illness. The illness would, if you are convincing enough, so that means enough electricity, you would persuade the patient that is curable, that is not really ill. And that was, electrotherapy was a normal method of treating at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, but that was electricity to the extreme. Even during the war in 1917, that was recognized as not humane, and families complained. There was much controversy during the war, around 1916-17, and at the time of in the last years of the war, more humane methods of treatment were applied. The problems of war shakers was a problem in all armies, not only in France but also in Germany. This is a picture of Kraepelin. Kraepelin is probably the best known psychiatrist from the turn of the century. Is an exact contemporary of Freud. Freud created psychoanalysis in Austria-Hungary, and Kraepelin, who was born the same year, 1856, is the ancestor of biological psychiatry or psychiatric classification. This is a text by Kraepelin saying that also in Germany, they were worried about having so many shakers, and shakers requesting compensation, and that the population was started pitying them, and this was generally bad for the morale on the home front. And on the previous slide, I showed you the torpedoing, electrical torpedoing by Clovis Vincent. The same method was used in Austria by a person called Kaufmann. And so that was also much debated in Austria-Hungary. In Austria-Hungary, there was a medicine Nobel Prize called Wagner Jaureg, who also applied this method. He was sued after the war, so that was controversial in many countries. Now, a term that's quite well known in English-speaking countries is shell-shock. The first medical paper about shell-shock was written by Myers in 1915. What is interesting in this first paper is that Myers described three soldiers that were treated at the hospital at Le Touquet on the French side of the English Channel. And two of these three soldiers were repatriated to England, to Blighty, as you say in your book. So two of those soldiers made it back to Blighty. And it's because that was in 1915, because later on in the war, they discovered that you had to treat as close to the front as possible, that if you repatriated someone, he would never come back. And so the method of treatment changed, and the theory was forward treatment close to the front line. And shell shock remain a term in English-speaking countries. Shell shock may have an ancestor. Shell shock is the idea that the explosion of the shell will induce fright, but might also induce anatomical lesions, like on small brain vessels, or maybe toxic gases or whatever. And this idea was already present during the 18th century war. It was called vent du boulet. The idea is that the cannonballs that passes close to you as a gust of wind, that also creates fright. And there's a very good description by the German writer Goethe. Goethe was present at the Battle of Valmy. Valmy was a battle during the French Revolution between French troops and Austro-Prussians. And the interesting fact about Valmy is that there was no fight. It was only an artillery duel. So the two opposing armies fought each other with artillery. And Goethe was there, and he described how unpleasant, how frightening that can be. The Austro-Prussian side withdrew. It's not known why, but there's a theory. A theory is that the Duke of Brunswick was bribed to retreat, was bribed not to fight, and that he was bribed with the Hope Diamond. The Hope Diamond is now in America. It's in Washington at the National Natural History. You have the Hope Diamond. The Hope Diamond is a huge diamond that was found in India that belonged to the French crown, that mysteriously disappeared at that time in 1792, resurfaced decades later in London, and was bought by a wealthy American family called the Hope family, and now it's on display in Washington. And it looks credible. This story looks credible. Now, I'm continuing with the diagnosis. A diagnostic term that was successful was psychoneurosis, war psychoneurosis. And probably, so war psychoneurosis is inspired by Freudian psychology. So it postulates that fright will induce a specific kind of anxious disorders. Psychoneurosis, or today PTSD, is not only neurology, it's not only hysteria, it's not only malingering, but it's a specific anxious disorder. And the answer of that is war psychoneurosis. There are many books toward the end of the war. So as the knowledge evolved fast. Those books were published in 1917. And also an ancestor of traumatic neurosis is the traumatic neurosis that was described for the first time in 1884 by a German called Oppenheim after observing railway accidents. The first traumatic neurosis is railway accidents. That was during the industrialization of Europe. And the people who are casualties in railway accidents complained of many aches, spine aches, and it was not known if it was already debated at the time, was it only psychological, or was it micro lesions, very small lesions of very small blood vessels in the spine. So it was the same debate. Is it neurological, micro lesions that you cannot see, or is it psychological? So that's the ancestor of traumatic neurosis and today's PTSD. Shortly after the war, many books were published. And the book on the right is a book by French authors about war neurosis in the German military. The French doctors at the time were keen to write that the Germans were not superiors, and that the French had war neurosis, but also the Germans had war neurosis, and they researched German archives to show that the French were not better psychologically, not more solid psychologically than the French soldiers. A very key concept in the evolution of treatments that was already mentioned by Emily is that very early people discovered that if the soldiers were evacuated to the rear, they would never come back. And there were huge incentives to keep the symptoms. And an American doctor, Thomas Salmon, described the key concepts of treatment near the front line: immediacy, proximity, expectancy. So you expect that the patient will recover fast, simplicity, and centrality. There's only one therapeutic team. It's understandable that the soldier preferred to be evacuated. I chose this picture because Frantz Adam was a psychiatrist, and after the war he came to the hospital in Alsace where I work. So he was the first, I work in a hospital in Alsace, which became French in 1918. And this doctor and photographer, Frantz Adam, was the first medical director of my hospital when it became French. And this is a first aid station near the front. And if you are soldiers, you would prefer to be evacuated. If you are a soldier in World War I, if you had a choice, you would not stay in the first aid station that was on the previous slide, but you would prefer to be evacuated to the rear home and to be taken care of by those nurses. So that's I would choose treatment number 2 instead of treatment number 1, and so that's all soldiers had the same idea, and so that's why once we evacuated soldiers to the rear, they would never come back. War neurosis is not new, so it was described, the diagnosis of PTSD was described after Vietnam War, but there are cases that were described by Herodotus after the Battle of Marathon. A Greek soldier was almost killed by a Persian soldier, but he survived. Only his friend near him was killed, but that Greek soldier remained blind for all the rest of his life. So it's his first case of traumatic neurosis, of PTSD. And also Icelandic saga, and also during the 100 Years' War that involved Britain and France, cases of traumatic of PTSDs were already described. Soldiers who could not sleep at night because they woke up and had enacted combat dreams, dreamt that they were fighting. This is also a picture that was taken by Frantz Adam. So it's interesting because it shows German POWs digging graves. Those German POWs are digging graves for the future French casualties. So it's in preparation for the next offensives. And on this slide, in fact, those who have the nicest, the most pleasant, most secure position against expectation, against appearances, are the German POWs, because they will survive. And the French soldiers who are watching will take part in the next offensive, and some of them may have those tombs as their last abode. I'll conclude with there was much poetic creation during World War I, and as already mentioned by Emily, and two well-known British soldiers who died during the war left beautiful poetry. Wilfred Owen died 1 week before the armistice, but he left this poetry that it's not, one always said that it's sweet and glorious to die for his country, and he says in this poetry that once you have seen gassed soldiers spitting blood from their lungs, you know that it's not, you cannot say that it's glorious and pleasant and sweet to die for your country. Rupert Brooke died on the Greek front, so he died on the Aegean, on a French hospital ship on the Aegean Sea, so between Turkey and Greece, and he left this poetry that where he will die, that will be a piece of English soil. So he will die. He knew that he would die somewhere else, far away from home, but the earth above his tomb would be a piece of English soil. I will conclude with this. There were many after the war. There were many amnesiacs. At the start of this presentation, we spoke about battle hypnosis, but some soldiers remained amnesiacs for weeks or years. And this is the best-known case of amnesiac, soldiers called Anthem Mangin, who died in 1942. So sometime in 1916 or 17, he was found on the platform of a railway station in Lyon. And he didn't know his name, he just said Mangin, but Mangin is also the name of a French general at the time. And he came on a... He was probably French POWs in Germany. The Germans put him on a train through Switzerland. There were exchanges of POWs between France and Germany through Switzerland. And he was found at the railway station in Lyon, no recollection whatsoever of his name. And he was claimed, his picture was put in many newspapers, and initially many families recognized him. For the family, there was a financial incentive to recognize him because the soldier would bring a war pension. And many families recognized him, but this guy never recognized those who are supposed to be his wife, his children. And up to his death, it remained an enigma who he was. Now, this enigma is probably resolved, and it's likely that this soldier, this Anthem Mangin, had schizophrenia, probably. A case of schizophrenia, what was called at the time precocious dementia, what is called today schizophrenia. I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Many thanks.
How easy was it for the stretcher bearers to deal with gas attacks, and what were the casualty rates of people who were gassed?